Hello there. So, quite recently, we've been discussing a lot of contemporary ideas from the world of the arts and the world of depth psychology, but that doesn't really mean that we've transcended our inquiry into the realms of human primordial history just yet. And I think that by now we've already covered quite a lot of really good source material to do with these subjects, ranging from the cave art, of course, sky symbolism, animism, and the anatomy of the ritual process. But I want to finally start rounding off our inquiries into primordial history now, because next year in 2018, we're going to be focusing a lot more heavily on the ancient world symbolism and really amplify the developments that we've been making into understanding human psychology. So I want to start to start the process of wrapping things up now and kind of seal this period. I'm not going to say that we're going to abandon it altogether. There may be things in the future that spring to mind that are going to be prominent. I bet there will. But in terms of this being very much a phase that we've been going through, I want to start closing that off now. And I want to do that by closing on making a pair of 3 short-running videos that will unpack the earliest religious symbolism concerning the 2 primary powers that govern our experience in the world, those being the powers of life and the powers of death. So there will be 3 videos in each set, and in each of those we'll be focusing on a single symbol and talk about why it's relevant. And I think that this exercise is absolutely necessary, because the whole intent of our research into the reaches of our primitive past was to search for the essentials, the primal progenitor acts and expressions that have acted as the primers for the later ones to emerge. And by looking at what we can uncover about the earliest human expressions governing the powers of life and the powers of death, this can afford us an ability to contextualize why these patterns of action continue on into this day. Because we might look at our primitive ancestors and believe that we couldn't be further removed from them, when in fact that very modern notion is a distortion that obfuscates the underlying reality that we are still plugged into many of the same essential programs and styles of behavior that informed the lives of our early ancestors. And we know this because we still attend rituals that speak to the birth of new life entering into the world. And we still take part in ritual ceremonies that reconcile us to the reality of death. And the reason is because these 2 primary powers that speak to the human experience are primordial powers. They are as relevant to us today as they were to people living in Paleolithic forests thousands and thousands of years ago. And because they are still relevant to us and affect us in a profound way, the symbol-making parts of our mind produces activity that moves us to come to terms with that. And those symbolic processes are what we're going to be looking at in these 2 series. So I want to begin by looking at the first example in this series of these fertility symbols that we're going to be talking about, and see what they can say to us about the powers that they represent. So first of all, I want us to look at this image here of what is commonly called a Venus figure, and it's awarded its name so as to categorize a type of human figure that's very voluptuous in its proportions, and as we can see here, well, it's a lot more than voluptuous. It's almost deformed in its proportions, and that's very much a deliberate thing, because the people who made this particular figure, which is very old, it dates back to the Upper Paleolithic period, carved out these proportions and exaggerated them to symbolize the aspects of the womanly figure that were essential to the prosperity of life in those hard times. So we have three things really. First, we have the wide hips that are synonymous with childbearing, and even today we still use an expression, sometimes in a playful way, of complimenting the features of a woman by saying that she has good childbearing hips. And this is an evolutionary reference to designate those women who are the archetypes of prosperous childbearing and child rearing. These women have been successful at fulfilling their biological prerogative with a man and have perpetuated the line forward into history. We also see the large breasts that are ripe with the vitalizing fluid that will sustain those successful births and carry them on to further maturation. So there are some real vitalistic and life-nourishing components to this life symbol here. And finally, we have to remark about these fatty deposits around the body, and this is actually deserves some historical context to explain why this body type would be important to the minds of our earliest ancestor. So in order to understand this, we have to appreciate just how difficult the conditions were back then and how incredibly problematic child making and indeed child rearing was back then compared to the way that it is today. We are looking at times in the development of our species when there was no health insurance, there was no contraception, and there was no anesthetic for labor pains, and people were much more exposed to the harshness of nature to a degree that many modern people today find difficulty in appreciating. And this naturally, this meant that survival on the individual and the collective level was far more harsh and consequential than it sometimes is now. Being alive and being able to successfully bring new life into the world for both the sexes is always a complex system to appreciate because it informs us on so many different levels. But we have to reconcile our minds to the fact that we are talking about a stage in the development of our species where life expectancy and infant mortality would have been through the roof compared to what it is in modern developments. If you were male, you would have had to grow up very fast. There's not a lot of time for simply being free to enjoy yourself. You would have had to go out into the unknown and face the trials of natural forces on the outside of the community. And if you were female, you would have had to experience that on the inside of the community. So we're talking about perpetual pregnancy, perpetual birth, perpetual failure at giving birth, getting pregnancy pain and repeating that cycle until it was successful, and then the process of looking after the infants that have been born. Many of those would have tragically been converted into failures because of the fragility of human organisms for a very long time. It takes us a very, very long time to gestate into a position where we can actually be autonomous and fend for ourselves. And we're talking about times when the primacy of things was so existentially prominent. The powers of life and the powers of death were everything to you. This was your job back then. This was your career. Engendering life and facing up to the tragic consequences of life day after day. And when you see that, it's no wonder why these fertility symbols show up so prominently again and again in the surviving artifacts from this period, because the human brain was codifying in matter what was predominant to its sense of existence. In very much the same sense as we see exhibitions of wealth and exhibitions of glamour put on show in music videos today, the human brain will always articulate what is most prominent to it at various times. And when the overarching powers that govern your existence speak to the primacy of life and death, it's little wonder why fertility rites and fertility artifacts are so abundant in the times that we're looking at, and why they're not so much abundant in the times that we live in today. So a lot of these surviving fertility figures, like the Venus ones that we saw earlier, have been found set up in shrine-like structures, which lends us to the contemplation as to whether these idols made up part of a primordial fertility cult. And we see the reason why these figures have no feet. If you remember looking in those pictures, you'll have noticed that they didn't actually have any feet to them. And the reason for that is because when some of these artifacts have been found, they've been planted into the earth, very much like plants in the soil, which speaks to me greatly of the feminine association to nature and vegetation, which echoes into later religious expressions as well. There is a paleoanthropologist called Franz Hankar who suggests that the Venus embody the earliest expression of an underlying ritual idea that places the woman as the beginning and the continuance of life, as well as providing the symbolic form for the immortality of earthly matter, which in itself doesn't possess an essential form, but rather acts as the skin jacket that encapsulates all forms. So now we see that the fertile woman is not only a symbol of our organismic life-creating patterns, but also at the very much deeper level, incarnate of the very matter of creation itself. And now I want to close this off by exemplifying a ritual component of this notion of the fertile female in the stages of organic maturation that are essential to the reperpetuation of our systems of life. The Great Mother is representative of that primal element, the signifier of prime being the standout feature here. It is of first significance that the young organism shall be wedded to the primacy of the maternal yoke from which it sprang, and only as it develops on from that do we see a transference from the chthonic primacy of the Earth Mother to the governance of the man and the parental Sky Father who resides above and impregnates the fertile earth. And we see this still today in the rites of primitive communities who still hold on to this organic system of exchange with children, where a child will be born and it will have spent its time under the dominion of the mother for its earliest cycles, and then at a time when the organism has grown to a certain measure of its ability, the time comes for the child to be weaned off the mother's milk, and there's a ritualized process of drama where the men all in the village all conspire together and they barge into the house and they're making a big commotion and they snatch the child from the mother, who's completely complicit in all of this, of course, because she's seen it before, it's happened to them. And she then lapses into a kind of a staged lament, which is partly genuine and partly exaggerated, and which is reinforced by all of the other women in the community who come out of the hut and they're all weeping and as they see this child get dragged off by the man. And so there's this great drama around the transition from maternal security to adult responsibility. And so what the men do is they take the child away from the village into the outskirts of the province, and they give the child its new symbolic sustenance, not of milk, but of the blood of the man, which the adult life of the community, the child is to be inducted into and naturally become a enthusiastic and prosperous contributor. So we see here how the consequences of fertility, namely children, are given to this extended drama that proceeds after the organism is born. And this obviously plays a very big part in social conditioning and the laws of the community, etc., etc. But it also plants the individual into a greater context where he or she will now play their part into the vitality of the systems of life from which they sprang. And I think that this is so important to recognize how humans develop these social rituals. They aren't just created arbitrarily or merely account for the acts of some irrational expression that we in our enlightened position should move away from. They are in fact supra-rational, because they are the organizers of the organic systems that not only the individual, but the entire collective depends on for its survival and continuation. And by this, we can see how rites of ceremony are instrumental in the maintenance of systems of our lives, because without them, we find ourselves without life imagery to guide us, and without an intelligent context to underpin and harness the forces of our lived vitality towards a mature expression. And if we don't possess this, then we conclude into the world image that the West finds itself in today, which is of a life searching for context, a people grasping for roots, a corpus of cells without a nucleus to inform them. And that's very much front and center to us, in the same sense that these powers of life and death were to primitive peoples. Sure, that they didn't have hospitals and they didn't have hadron colliders, but they were in connection to an organic vitality, as harsh as it was and as consequential as it was, that we are going to have to reconnect with again. And when we look at this artificial system that we've created, that symbolizes a life support system, that might for a while contain this state of disembodiment that we find ourselves in, that is an inorganic system of living that, unlike nature, is not immortal. And when that life support system breaks down, as it gradually will do, we will need to be in a position to life where we possess what the world image is not, where we possess and power through the vitals that our artificial sensibilities are not successful in recreating. In other words, we need to accept the world image as the corpse that it is and put ourselves back into alignment with the organic principles of life and self-sacrifice that have engendered our species up to the problematic point where we are today. And we also have to realize that our world system is not going to provide that for us. Just as for our primitive ancestors, the rain wasn't going to stop raining, the wind wasn't going to stop biting, and our attempts and the attempts of our recreation, the failed attempts at our recreation that we say, the infant mortality that was happening, all of that wasn't simply going to stop just because we wanted them to stop. And it's my intention with a lot of these videos about our primordial past that we don't merely see them as interesting curiosities, which they certainly are. They're very interesting to me, but that we take from them a deeper significance that points us to those aspects of our modern lives that we need to pay attention to. By readdressing what we are at the root level, we can potentially bring to consciousness the significance of our own life states and what kind of creature that we actually are at the organic level. Not as a citizen, not as some economic unit, not as an automaton of some various ist or ism, but as an organism with a psychological ecosystem and a responsibility to bear for the consequences of our own existence. And when we realize this, when we truly realize this, our psychological system activates and we start to reorientate ourselves to life patterns that put us back in contact with the essential processes that engender a healthy life progression. And so that's what I hope that some of these videos will actually do. There's going to be 2 more in this series now of the fertility symbols, the powers of life, and the next one that will come is going to be about powers of death. So I'm going to, exchange from one to the other as we go through. There'll be 6 of them in total. But I hope that this has been an interesting introduction into some of these symbols, and I'm very looking forward to making the next one. But for now, I think that we'll call it a day. I want to thank you very much for watching and taking the time to listen to this. And as usual, I'll see you all again.